The Cold War was a 46-year period, from 1945 to 1991, of intense political, military, and economic competition between the USSR and the United States, each with their allies. While the United States and the Soviet Union never met directly on the battlefield, the Cold War involved an extensive nuclear and conventional arms race, espionage, bloody proxy wars, and fear-producing propaganda as both nations sought singular global supremacy.
Interview subject is Dave Wampler. Born in 1939, Dave was 6 when this era began. He has lived throughout the Cold War period, experiencing this time from a military, a student, and a citizen's perspective.
My only explanation for this whole period was it's kind of like a time when these two superpowers were trying to outdo each other, Russia and the United States. And whether it was about the space race or communism versus democracy, or who was the meanest and the biggest, and back and forth, and a lot of threats. Because my father was in the military, I'm in the Army. We had lived in Mississippi and North Carolina and Oklahoma. And I went to kindergarten on an Army base. And we used to like to go behind our house and have our wooden guns. And when the tanks came by, real tanks, we would shoot at them. And we never destroyed them.
Was your dad actually fighting, or?
You know, he never went to the war front, you know, like to Europe or to Japan. His job was to train other people to shoot this cannon. And this is before we had a GPS or technology. You still had to
Measure.
You measure on a map
the height.
Thing, and all this. You know, you had a protractor, and they figure out the shell went out, and if it missed, readjust the cannon and then shoot another one. So that's what he was doing.
The relieving of General Douglas MacArthur by President Truman was perhaps the most famous civilian-military confrontation in the history of the United States. General MacArthur was in command of the U.S. forces in Korea, and in the early stages of America's work there, MacArthur had devised some brilliant strategies that helped save South Korea from North Korea. But as the war progressed, one of MacArthur's final plans was to bomb Communist China in order to destroy the People's Republic of China. When proposed to Truman, he flatly refused these requests, and a public argument broke out between the two, resulting in General MacArthur being fired from his position. Truman later addressed this firing by saying, "It is not right for us to be in Korea and extending the war." General MacArthur was fired so that there would be no doubt or confusion as to the real purpose and aim of our policy. When MacArthur returned to the United States, he was greeted as a hero, but ultimately faded away as the American people understood that the general's policies and recommendations would have massively expanded the war in Asia.
Something happened that had never happened. The President of the United States was Truman, and he fired a general who was in charge of the armies in Korea, and his name was MacArthur.
Yep.
And I came from a military family, and we thought that MacArthur was, you know, the best guy in the world, wonderful general and all that. So I was so mad. I can remember being at school, like 5th or 6th grade, being so mad I was practically in tears. Arthur, what is that? And Truman flew all the way out to an island and met him and fired him. And it turns out that Truman was right. Well, you know, that wasn't any problem until recently, you know, that Mitch wouldn't have a choice.
It's
He
so
would
weird.
have a choice possibly, but they just drafted people. You know, you got a number, and if your number came up, you went, and then you got your training. And sometimes college students were exempt from going.
Yeah.
Sometimes if you were the sons of certain categories probably didn't go.
Yeah,
you know,
exactly.
They had government connection. Just an aside, that's what they say today is that a lot of this war stuff is fought by kids who don't have any, are not going to college, don't have, there's no draft, and they get recruited into the service sometimes. And so they say that like no congressman has a child in the military. And so it's not brought home to the people who need to know about it.
Dave talks about the draft and about how young men could be excluded from forced serving time. As we learned in class, a draft refers to the policy of conscription, requiring citizens to fulfill military service, and can occur during peace or wartime. In our country's history, drafts have been used during the Civil War, World War I, World War II, Korean War, and Vietnam War. Dave refers to service deferments and mentions one we learned in class. S2, service deferred for being enrolled in college. We found it interesting how our interviewee commented that he thought certain sons of high government officials were able to remove themselves from going to war, and that people working in government actually need these first-hand accounts to know how to better or change war efforts.
Yeah, how was all this kind of portrayed in high school? How did they teach you about it? Was it really biased? Could you tell, or?
I don't think so. My U.S. history teacher was really a person who sort of shared a lot of different sides of things, show you how it might be different or how a Russian person might think about that. Yeah. But the other thing, Mitch, is that this was, and I guess that's part of the issue. We didn't know a lot about what was going on in Russia until later. I mean, some of these things happened. You didn't know how many people they had in prison. You didn't know about the famines they had. You didn't know about, they had an awful system.
Earlier this year, we read Michael Parenti's The Control of History. In this document, Parenti explains how history is biased, how what students learn in school and what civilians are told can only be part of what's actually happening. This biasness, Parenti explains, has many factors, from the people recording the history to the protection of civilians. We connected this document to when Dave says that they didn't know what was going on in Russia. Maybe specific facts about the crisis in Russia wasn't shared so that alarm didn't spread throughout America.
And we had drills in school about under your desk, and at one time they were furnishing mask things for people to wear too in schools, gas mask kind of thing. Yeah. But
according to a secondary source, after the atomic bomb was dropped, President Truman created the Federal Civil Defense Administration. Their most famous act was publishing the cartoon showing a precautionary drill of duck and cover. This drill was practiced regularly at school. Students would get under their desks and cover their heads with their hands.
I remember that there was bright. Really, they had a lot of spotlights, big spotlights on it at night, and I don't know why they did it at nighttime. And they had some, major equipment like bulldozers and equipment like that, and they began to just push it down and tear the wall down. And people started streaming through that wall, just leaving immediately. Well, they probably thought they could go back and forth, but it's like any, if you build a wall.
Dave later spoke of how he went to Berlin, Germany, and saw the remains of the Berlin Wall. He mentioned how the wall was covered with graffiti and is a mural which people paint on every day. We further discovered that 3 sections remain from the original wall, each section about 260 feet. Sources say that the wall today is not an accurate representation of the wall's original presence, as it has been badly damaged by souvenir seekers.
Through the assignment, we learned about a first-hand perspective of a man who lived throughout the entire era. Our biggest takeaway was realizing that someone who was alive during the time period didn't think of all the factors that are outlined to us today. For example, people were typically unaware of what was truly going on in respect to events going on in the country or overseas.